Xavier, a top achieving student, he actually got perfect marks in VCE English, 50 out of 50, and he got an ATAR of 99.1.
One thing I said to my teacher at the start of the year is be as harsh as possible, because otherwise it's not going to push me to do better.
You looked at it in this very competitive sense.
That sort of thing, I think, was a big part of my success.
How many hours were you studying in total? What's up everyone, it's Johnny from Jedel. Welcome back to another episode, another interview with a top achieving student. Today I'm actually speaking with Xavier. Xavier is from Victoria and he just did incredibly well in his VCE exams. He actually got perfect marks in VCE English, 50 out of 50, got 47 out of 50 in literature, and he got an ATAR of 99.1. So Xavier, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing your wisdom with current and future students.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Congratulations, first of all, on the results. Obviously, just saying those marks, 50 out of 50 in VCE English, which is just so hard to do, shows how well you did and also just how much you must have studied. And we'll get into that as well in terms of strategy, how you studied efficiently, how you avoided burnout. I'm sure everyone's wondering, what are the secrets to getting perfect marks in VCE English? So perhaps first question is, now reflecting back, we were just saying before this, you had a couple months to relax and kind of get your mind off the VCE. When you think back to your final year of school, how do you think about it now? When you look back at it, like how would you describe that journey from start to finish in that final year?
I think it was honestly one of my favorite years of school. Yeah, probably the top year that I've had both socially and academically. I felt really proud of my accomplishments, that I used my time well and that my study paid off, but I didn't lose any of my relationships with friends or family in the process. So yeah, I was pretty happy with how it all went.
How did you go about balancing that kind of study life balance? Because it can be a tricky one, right? Especially as exams creep up and then you've got final exams. Did you have a particular structure to your weeks on average? Like talk us through what a typical week looked like for you in year 12.
Yeah, so I try to make sure that most of my study stayed in school time. So I really used my class time effectively, and if there was any time that I had to sort of do any extra work, I used those, especially private studies, to try and limit the amount of work I did at home as little as possible, because I felt I wasn't going to focus at home as much as I was at school. So a lot of that came to studying after school a few times, but on a typical weeknight, I usually studied directly as I got home. I had a bit of a snack, studied up until dinner, and then if I didn't have anything like a SAC coming up or any extra revision that I wanted to get ahead of, I really try to let myself have those evenings to myself and not feel the pressure to, have to study until 10 p.m. each night. If I had a SAC coming up, obviously I'd put a little bit of extra effort in there. But to be honest, I really try to separate and have dinner as afterwards I can sort of relax and unwind and prepare for the next day.
Yeah, so you kind of paced yourself and you picked your spots when to really go hard before assessments, which is smart. Allow yourself to kind of recharge the batteries in those off-peak periods. What about the weekends? How did they typically look like for you?
Yeah, weekends were a tricky one because most of the time I had work in the mornings, referee basketball games. So that was sort of my exercise as well that I got to have in the mornings leading into the afternoon. So that was for Saturday. So I try to leave Saturday as a little as possible because I felt I wasn't going to study productively after running around refereeing basketball for 5 or so hours. So Sunday I really try to make it my study day, especially from mid-morning to late afternoon. That was really when I crunched down. Try to make the most of that, especially trying to gain momentum as I went into Monday and not having to sort of, be jolted by the Monday blues, as some people sort of, if they don't study well on the weekends, Monday can be a bit of a shock and you can't really get into the week as productively as you want. So that was my plan for the weekends.
And when you did those study blocks, whether it was on the weekend or an afternoon on a school day, what did your typical program look like? Did you kind of settle into a consistent structure where you would always start with a particular subject? How did you organize that, and did you have a schedule for that?
A lot of the time, I didn't have a lot of homework for one of my subjects being art. That was more of a folio subject I did throughout the year, little by little when I needed to, and I could do a lot of that in class time. But for legal and psychology were my main content heavy subjects. So I usually did those first by reading through the content and then answering questions. That was pretty similar for the whole year on the homework that we got. For English and literature, that was usually later on in the evenings and just before dinner. Or sometimes I woke up in the morning a little bit and try to write it first thing in the morning just to get the creative juices flowing. So usually those were essays or reading articles and looking over some past examples as well. So I typically did the content heavy stuff first and then went into the writing towards the end.
Yeah, that makes sense. And did you find that certain areas of English, say, were more demanding than others? Like, were you spending most of your time doing text responses over others, or did it just depend on where you were at in the year?
I think it depended more on where I was in the curriculum. Coming towards the end of the year in my exam, I felt, for English at least, argument analysis was the point I wanted to focus on the most because I'd done very well throughout the year for that area of study. But compared to the other two parts, section A and section B of the exam, it was the one I felt least confident in. So I think my priority was to get better at that throughout the year.
Hey everyone, it's Johnny from Jedel, and if you want to check out state rank examples, band 6 analysis, step-by-step guides to constructing the perfect essays, craft of writing pieces, whatever it is that you need for your English exams, then go to jedel.com. We've put everything in one place for you so that you don't need to look any further to get everything you need to succeed in your exams. And if you want to submit a draft and get expert marking, or you want to use our marking tools to get specific suggestions on how you can improve your essays, your creative writing pieces, anytime, anywhere, make sure you sign up to Jedi. It's less than $10 per week.
Zooming into the VCE English course in particular, a lot of people always wonder, what's kind of the secret there. What do you think were a few of the key strategies in terms of your preparation, how you studied, how you prepared? What do you think were those essential things that helped set you apart from everyone else? And not to say, you looked at it in this very competitive sense, but what do you think were those things that helped you stand out?
I think at the end of the day, people always tell you don't want to go into exams with memorized content. You don't want to go in over prepared in that sense and know exactly what you're going to write down before you even see the prompts. Because at the end of the day, then you're not going to be responding to the prompt in the most accurate way possible. But the way I did look at it was the more you practiced, the more that will sort of unconsciously happen. Because for section B, I did writing about play. All those topics and stimuli that I looked at, all the practices, eventually they began to sort of repeat, and there were a few themes that came up time and time and again. And you can sort of notice the patterns that present themselves. So for play, there was either something to do with sport, something to do with age, or something to do with technology. And once you sort of recognize that those patterns cropped up again and again in the practices, you were able to prepare a bit more for that. And it's not to say that I recommend memorizing entire pieces of work, but for me at least, I have a pretty good memory. So my goal was to be confident in a few pieces of writing and that I could adapt on the day. Because once I learned to write them quick enough, I had the time in the exam or the SAC to adapt and use that extra time to fit my piece to the exam mold.
So it's not a matter of direct memorization, but almost indirect memorization. It's like this familiarization process where you still feel confident with a lot of the material, and I imagine you wanted to have high quality material, so it didn't make sense to just get in there on the day and improvise completely. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, the more you do it, the more it'll sort of just flow out of your hand while you're writing it.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And that's a great kind of balance there between memorizing, which could be for the wrong reason in terms of just getting ready to regurgitate something on the day and not respond to the topic, but also having some really sophisticated material that is essential to get top marks. So I think that's a great way of doing it. Doing lots of practice, looking for kind of common threads, and then trying to reuse as much of the material as possible as you do different questions to really refine and perfect. So that's a great piece of advice. What about with text responses and essays?
Yeah, those ones were tricky because we did Oedipus, the king, as our main text response throughout the year. And being a Greek play, there is a language barrier from our time and the time it was written. So getting your head around what they were talking about in the first place was a little tricky. But it's similar to section B. There's only a few major themes there's a few, but once you get through them all, you realize that, this evidence applies for this theme as well as this theme. So again, familiarizing yourself with the content and with the text, and you begin to see the patterns, and that you don't want to be memorizing chunks of an essay because you're never going to get the prompt in an exam or SAC that you prepared for in your own time or for homework. but the evidence and the analysis that you do in class time and that you can develop and get feedback on can be applicable in different scenarios with different bits. You can just sort of remember like, oh, I talked about this in a practice essay, I can use this for this topic, but it's not regurgitating an entire paragraph or anything like that. But I guess my main advice would be keep looking at prompts, try and group prompts together. If you like get given a group of 20 or 30 by your school, go through them before you try and do one individually, group them into themes and look how similar they are, and feel confident that if it was any one of those prompts, you could answer it to the best of your ability, knowing that you have knowledge of the theme and the evidence related to that.
So did you still have a kind of structure in mind when you were drafting your responses? Did you still have particular groupings in terms of that evidence and analysis that you felt like were flexible enough that you could use for a lot of the different prompts? So that you basically knew, look, I have 3 paragraphs and the first one is typically going to be on this theme and I have this evidence, but I'm going to tweak what I kind of say specifically about it. Was it that approach, or you didn't have a predetermined structure in terms of the themes?
I think I had a predetermined structure, but it wasn't necessarily themed based. It was more, if it was, say, do you agree to this topic, or to what extent do you agree, or discuss, I typically went, I agree with the topic, then disagree, and then I disagree because of this sort of twist on the topic that I try to find. So in that sense, I was always sort of doing an agree, disagree, disagree, twist, or sometimes an agree, agree, disagree, twist, or any combination of those. I did find myself reusing evidence over and over again because I found that it just fit with what I was looking at. A good way I tried to balance that was group my evidence in each paragraph with different types of evidence. So for example, paragraph 1 would have a stage direction, a quote, maybe some imagery, or nautical imagery was the one I used quite a bit. And then the second paragraph might be some imagery, a symbol, a quote, or a characterization, or a juxtaposition between 2 characters. So that sort of variety of evidence sort of grouped around the same ideas really helped, because it felt like I wasn't just grabbing quotes constantly, because I think that's a trap that many students can fall into, is just using only quotes and maybe a symbol here or there. But especially for plays like Oedipus, using stage directions, some of the conventions like stickomythia, or the way the dialogue is structured, those sort of things can really set your essay apart.
Yeah, so those macro features, those things to do with the form and the style that are often unique to that particular text type, like a play, you're saying having that in each paragraph in tandem with specific quotes and language features is a good way to set you apart.
Yeah, because that way you're not having to memorize 20 plus quotes. Max, you've got 10 good quotes in your bank, and you can sort of, maybe a bit more than 10, maybe 15 or so, and then you can scatter them throughout your paragraphs with those different form analysis, conventions, style, to support that argument that you're putting forward.
And with respect to that analysis, if we zoom in on some of those sentences where you were using quotes, was there anything in particular that you tried to do? Did you try to use shorter quotes? Did you try to integrate them into the sentence? Was there anything tactically there that you were doing to increase the sophistication?
Yeah, I definitely try to use shorter quotes, and especially with longer passages and monologues that you get in Greek plays and tragedies, shortening quotes to the bare minimum and the root of what you're trying to analyze is really important, because then it can clog up your paragraphs really quickly. But you do also want to be analyzing a lot of quotes, and having multiple examples. So what I try to do is, if I had a passage that I really liked, I'd sort of cut out every second chunk of the words and group those mini quotes all into one, so it didn't lose the effect of what the quote was representing, but also so it had the fluency for the assessors to read through and not feel like it was getting bogged down in retelling the story.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Do you have any other tips in terms of how you approach the analysis, maybe in terms of your explanations, what you were saying about the quotes? How did you elevate the quality and level of that part of your analysis?
I think a big thing for me was my vocabulary. Throughout the year, my main goal was to learn as many synonyms for themes and analytical verbs as possible, because I think when you're in tough conditions, you're going to end up repeating yourself and not notice. So words such as, I know I use reveals and exposes, illustrates and demonstrates quite a bit, and I wasn't really noticing it until I read out my work aloud. So I think something that can really help set apart your writing from an expression and fluency standpoint, and to make your arguments and evidence pop is developing a really sophisticated and wide vocabulary that can sort of, if they see a fancy word, it's not necessarily going to give you an extra mark, but it's going to subconsciously in an assessor's mind think this person knows what they're talking about, and they're talking and writing in a high caliber of expression. And so yeah, that sort of thing I think was a big part of my success in analyzing evidence and quotes.
Yeah, so vocabulary. You also mentioned there reading your work aloud, which I think is a really good point, and I just want to zoom in on that for a second, because I think what a lot of students do is they'll write something, but they never actually say it out loud, and they can't pick up on little blemishes or little parts of the sentences where they lose that flow. So talk us through that. When you prepared an essay or when you were preparing a draft, what did that process look like for you start to finish in terms of going through some of those things like reading it out loud, getting feedback, etc.? Kind of take us through a start to finish, SAC preparation process.
Yeah. So if I had a topic that I felt pretty confident about, that was going to be similar to what the SAC or exam was going to be, I usually had, in the lead up, I had a good feeling based on what the teachers were getting us to focus on. For the SACs in particular, I'd really focus on a few topics with different themes, and in the lead up to the week, I'd break down those topics, write practice paragraphs, use parts of my old essays as well if I thought they were applicable, because you can do that when it's not under time conditions. And I recommend keeping bits of analysis that you really like, both if you wrote them or if someone else did. It's really good to be able to copy that, because at the end of the day, you either wrote it yourself or you can recognize that's really good. And you're not going to copy analysis perfect word for word if someone else has done it. You can definitely be inspired though and say, that's a really good point. I never viewed that symbol in this way. So I'll definitely try and construct my essays and then get feedback, both peer and teacher feedback. And then, reading it aloud is really important, especially for me throughout the year. For section A and B for writing that play, reading aloud was actually a great tool for sort of that familiarization and unconscious memorization, because the more I read it aloud, I not only had the visual memorization or familiarization, but auditory as well. And that really helped me keep writing quickly and remember what came next if I had a bit of analysis that I was wanting to use in SAC conditions. So I think reading aloud really gets it imprinted in your brain and ingrained fairly well, and it worked really well for me.
And how did you go about timing in terms of preparing for timed exam conditions? Is that something you were also conscious of in the lead up in terms of how much you could write feasibly in the allotted time frame?
Yeah, timing was a big one for me. Because I also do literature, I had to be very conscious that I didn't overwrite, because then my hand would just fall off and I wouldn't be ready for the next day or couldn't be able to practice. So it wasn't necessarily about writing as fast as I could. It was being sustainable and economical with how much I wrote. A big part of that was once I had typed a practice, I often tried to handwrite it once I got feedback, just copying it down. I'll have it up on my computer and handwriting it, but I kept myself to under an hour, and that really helped, knowing that what I was typing could be written in an hour. And same with the reading things aloud, writing it down adds another layer to that memorization and familiarization. That's really critical for English.
And length and word count is something people always talk about. What did you find was kind of the sweet spot in terms of how many words you could write per text response in exam conditions?
I'm not actually entirely sure about the word count, more went on the pages. Obviously everyone's handwriting is going to be different, but my goal was to write at least 5 pages for all different sections. Section B, I typically wrote a little bit more because I had a bit more of an idea of what I was going to write and could fit in a bit more if I'd familiarized it. Section A was typically 6, and then section C was I aimed for 5, sometimes it was 4, but those were my goals for the different sections. I think word count wise, they were all around 1,000 words or more from memory.
And that's 1,000 words that you've cut down to get there? You probably had drafts that were a lot longer, and then have you consciously worked at refining them and making them as concise as possible?
Yeah, I think for the body paragraphs, it's a little bit difficult to sort of whittle them down in the moment, but I really made an effort to make my introductions and conclusions as concise as possible and not laboring on any points that are just there because you want an extra sentence for your conclusion. So my conclusions were typically either 2 sentences, sometimes even a sentence long, because at the end of the day, it's not part of the rubric. It's just restating what you've put in your paragraphs and introduction. And then for my introduction, I had a really set structure that I stuck with and that I used it became a bit formulaic by the end, but I think at that point, you're trying to make it as good as possible. So it's less about making it something fresh and new each time and just sticking to what works for you.
And what was that formula for you with the introductions?
From the top of my head, I did an inverted opening with usually a theme, or like the themes of knowledge and ignorance are explored in this text. The context, so for Oedipus, it was 5th century Athens. Then my contention, my 3 body paragraphs, and then just a concluding statement with an essentially, this is my contention reworded. And then I think that ended up being 6 or 7 sentences that I just stuck with, and I felt confident going into my exams that I could do that in 3 minutes and then get straight to my introduction. To my first paragraph.
And when you say inverted opening, do you mean starting as broad as possible and then narrowing in?
What I mean by that is the structure of it. So typically an essay might start like, in Shakespeare's Macbeth, he explores the themes of power and masculinity, for example. But an inverted opening, I'd switch that and go, the concepts of masculinity and power are elucidated in Shakespeare's 11th century play Macbeth, or whenever it was set. So that's just a tiny structure thing.
Yes, just a little specific thing that you can do to set yourself apart even there straight away off the bat. Instead of the teacher reading that same opening in that first sentence, you put the theme first, followed by the text.
So yeah, another thing that helped me with that, especially my introductions, was trying to be as alliterative as possible. So having the 2 themes start with the same letter and trying to make it from the get-go as sort of smooth and fluid as possible. So the teachers not only were like agreeing with what I was saying, but also enjoyed reading what I was writing.
And I guess that's where the reading out loud comes back into it, because you can hear the alliteration as you say it. And that's a cool little kind of quirk, I guess, to your approach, because you're really thinking about it from the marker's perspective. And hey, I want this to sound nice and I want this to read well as the teacher goes through it. So that's a really important kind of empathetic consideration there that I think students should probably pay more attention to on average. What about with your body paragraphs? Did you always do 3 body paragraphs?
Yeah, 3 was what I stuck with. For literature, my teacher pushed me to do 4, but I just stuck with the 3 because I found that was most manageable for me and worked every single time. So 3 was the way I went.
And just quickly on the structure for each of those, was it topic sentence straight into analysis, or did you have a kind of formula there that you would follow?
Yeah, I had a formula for that as well. Definitely had a topic sentence, and then my English teacher was big on having a clarifying sentence. So sort of making my topic sentence be general and then clarifying, linking to a bit more of the text. And then from there, it was identifying the point I was making, presenting the evidence, the impact of that evidence, sometimes with some reader impact, as well as reaffirming the author's intention with the words or the characterizations or symbols they were putting forward.
And then you would get into, you do all your analysis. Would you have a link sentence at the end?
Yeah, I'll definitely, some words like thus, therefore, hence. For my conclusion, I'd use ultimately, but those sort of words, and then a linking sentence at the end to sort of tie everything back together.
So that again speaks to the fact that you can have some kind of sentence starters and things like that just to make life a little bit easier when you're responding to a question, because you don't want to have to be coming up with every single word, every single start from scratch. And I think that's a point you've illustrated nicely, that there's a balance there between responding to what you get on the day, but also making life a little bit easier as well by already having some of the materials there and working in some of those structures and formulae, if you like. So that's really good advice. Anything else on the essays in general? Anything else that you think, oh, this was something I did that helped kind of set me apart from others?
I'd definitely recommend not only getting teacher feedback, but peer feedback. And it comes down to everyone's going to have the different ideas to you, as well as I think a big part for me was not only the ideas and the analysis, but also the vocabulary, because everyone's sort of got, like, you can pick up on it pretty quick just by reading 1 or 2 of someone else's essays. They've got their favorite words that they like to use, and just seeing what they are and sort of broadening your own vocabulary I think is really important. And one other thing that is similar to that for the vocabulary. At the start of the year, I opened a ChatGPT chat and just with the simple command, for every word I put in here, generate 10 high quality synonyms. So every time, mainly at the start of the year when I was like at home trying to type up a body paragraph, I'd just put a word in there and get 10 synonyms. And while it's ChatGPT and you can't really take credit for it, at the end of the day, it's just synonyms, so it's not major plagiarization or anything like that. And by the end of the year, you don't even need it because you've seen so many synonyms and different words that have expanded your vocabulary, and you've unconsciously memorized all these different options, and you feel a lot more confident in your writing when you can draw upon different resources, both online and mentally, once they become a bit more familiar.
And did you find that GPT was particularly useful for anything else in your preparation for English?
It didn't really know the texts as well, so I definitely recommend against trying to get it to generate a body paragraph or responding to an essay topic, because at the end of the day, it's not trained to respond to it based on the VCE curriculum. It's going to have its own sort of check marks and criteria. So it's not going to be reliable or accurate at all in that sense. I think generating ideas for section B definitely has some value there, because it can just be a little bit of just a starting point for you to springboard straight off. And once you get a root of an idea, it entirely becomes your own once you sort of begin to express it and make it your own, because it's just going to be a sentence it gives you, and then you can make it your own or completely ignore it and it triggers another thought. So definitely for brainstorming ideas creatively for section B, but section C, it doesn't really help. Section A, I'd recommend against it because it's not going to give you the high quality response that you want.
And just turning to analysing argument for a moment, what did you find were the most effective study strategies and kind of preparation techniques for that section?
I think for analysing argument, it was all down to practice and handwriting the practices, because at the end of the day, section B and section A, you can sort of, it's more about the ideas and the behind it, whereas section C at its core is a skill and it's something you can get better as you practice. And it's not as intellectual, it's more in the repetitive side of things and strengthening different types of analysis that you do. It was definitely the one that was my main focus in exam preparation. And I don't know, actually, I haven't got the exam breakdown for my English exam yet, but I must have done all right. So I think it all went to plan in the end for section C. But yeah, practice and just do as many as you can is the way to go for that.
And speaking of practice and doing as many as you can, a lot of people ask about, how much you need to study before the exams, especially as you get to the end of the year. So how much were you studying at the end of the year in terms of a daily study schedule?
Yeah, because I had English and literature to sort of balance that out, because I didn't want to be writing essays constantly, but at the same time, the way you get better is by writing. So my goal was, because I was so focused on section C, that I'd write a section C a day. And then on top of that, probably not every single day, but 5 times a week probably. And then those other days I'd focus on literature more. Section A and B, I didn't necessarily practice as much writing. For section B, I wrote out a few just to familiarize myself. Section A was a lot more topic breakdowns and adapting what I already knew to those topics as quickly as possible. And then, once I had the section C done for most days of the week, then I could focus on my other subjects and do the more content heavy things. So it was mainly a balance between English and then the content heavy subjects as well.
And in terms of a typical day, including all subjects, how many hours were you studying in total?
Yeah, when I was in the holidays, so when I was at home, I typically probably slept into around 9 or 10, try to get in a lot more of the content stuff early in the day before lunch. So probably had lunch 12:30 or 1, and everything before then was psychology or legal. And then in the afternoon, I'll try to knock out an essay, most of the time being section C. And then after that, it would just be small passive revision activities. So maybe something for art or brainstorming ideas for literature or English. But I try to limit myself to 2 to 3 subjects a day, with one always being English or literature, and then switching out the other ones.
And at what time were you typically clocking off and kind of putting the books down?
It depended on the day, but I'd say probably around 4 because I felt most productive in the mornings. And if I can get a really good start to the day and be productive and limit my breaks to meal times, I think I didn't need to study more than that. It would be good, I think, in hindsight, if I wanted to maybe focus a bit more on some of the content or practice questions, like, because obviously I didn't get perfect scores in anything else in English, but so you can always do better. But I think it still worked for me, and I was really happy with the results I yielded because of that plan that I had to sort of go from 8 or 9 in the morning to maybe 4 p.m. each day and allow myself to have the afternoons and evenings to relax, and because you don't want to burn out. Otherwise, no study is going to be productive.
Yeah, that's good advice. And in terms of advice, what was the most helpful piece of advice you think you got from a teacher in Year 12?
I'm not sure if it was advice, but rather just going to them and talking to them as not only as teachers, but as people, because they've taught Year 12, well, for the most part, they're going to have been teaching Year 12 for quite a while, and they're familiar with how students are feeling and what they're going through. So I think, yeah, just talking to them as people and not as teachers is really helpful. They're wanting you to succeed, and they're also great for having a balance between constructive criticism as well as positive reaffirmation and sort of praising you, but also pushing you to keep going and not be complacent with where you're at. I think one thing I said to my teacher at the start of the year is be as harsh as possible, because otherwise it's not going to push me to do better than my baseline. So I think, yeah, teachers is a main thing to build a camaraderie with and a rapport, because they'll help you throughout the year and want you to succeed.
And any other kind of departing wisdom or final advice for students who are going through VCE or just going through school in general?
I definitely think it's a balancing act, and yeah, social lives are so important in Year 12 because, you know, you're turning 18, there's going to be parties throughout the year, and you don't want to sort of commit heavily to one and not neglect your study, or the opposite and just fully bury yourself in study and completely forget about your social life. So I think you've got to balance it, whether that's by splitting it up time-wise or whether it's just having constant support group or a study group that allows you to study hard and study well, but also allows you to enjoy Year 12 and enjoy being a teenager and your final year of high school. So make the most of it. Don't neglect your studies, but don't neglect your social life either.
Great advice. So Xavier, thanks so much for coming on here, sharing all of your kind of strategies and just general advice on how to approach the final year of school. Congratulations again on the results, and hopefully we can chat again soon, but good luck. I know you're going on to do arts law degree at Monash, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Amazing. So I'm sure there's a lot of students watching this who are probably dreaming about doing the same. So good luck to everyone watching as well. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys in the next one.